Good evening. It's Monday, November 23rd. This is May.
23rd.
I had a long day already.
May 85th.
May 85th, yes. All right. Take two. It's Monday, May 23rd at 6 p.m. This is the Community Consolidated School District 59 Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting. Can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Ms. Espino.
Here.
Ms. Lang is present. Mr. Mancia is absent. Ms. Petrielli is absent. Mr. Reed,
Present.
Dr. Sager,
Present.
Ms. Schumacher.
Present.
Okay. Before we begin, make sure when we're talking, your mics are on. We talk loudly so everyone in the public can hear us. With that, can we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? Since we don't have students here, I'll ask the SLT to start us out.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Item 4.0, public comments and suggestions from the public. I don't see anyone here, so I think we will move right on to 5.0, special interest topic. And I hope everyone's ready for this.
All right, good evening, everyone. So we are very excited to be here at the end of our 21-22 school year and excited to talk about where we are in terms of our strategic plan with a specific emphasis on our equity work. Hopefully our community and our board feels that we have throughout the year highlighted our work and maintained continuous communication around our goal areas. But tonight we are going to get into some very specifics around our strategic plan and our equity work. I'm very happy to have our SLT team with us tonight to be able to contribute. Our hope is that the format for tonight will really be a discussion amongst all of us. There will be a lot of data that will be shared. So we encourage us to ask questions along the way, engage in some discussions. With that, I would also like to preface that the purpose of sharing the level of detail that we are tonight is to kind of move into phase 2 of our communication plan so that we can begin to engage our community members, our schools, and our staff at a slightly more detailed view of where we really stand in terms of our student outcomes, our current systems and procedures that we have in place as they relate to equity. This by no means is a look back to cast blame or point fingers. It is really to enlighten ourselves so that we can engage in meaningful work and decision making that is based on data, so that when we know better, we can do better. And that's really been kind of our motto around this work. So hopefully we can approach this tonight with some open minds and with a lot of questions. Why does our data look the way it does? What are the things that have led us to where we are today so that we can continuously improve? We can celebrate the things that are working well for our students and our families, and we can move forward with progress for the last 4 years of our strategic plan. So with that, we're going to go down just a little bit and look at our recap of our strategic plan. Please.
I know one thing you talked about was like, a discussion. When would you want us, like, right when we have a question to bring it up, or when, like, maybe when we finish a group of, like, a topic or something like that, we can stop and have a discussion? I just want to make sure, because I don't want to, like, go one screen and we have like 10 questions, and maybe go one screen, have another 10 questions.
Yes.
But I also want to go like 20 or 30 screens.
Right. We will kind of chunk them up. They're in various categories. So once we're fully finished presenting the information on a specific category, then we will kind of pause and we can have opportunities for discussion, clarification, questions. So I think it'll naturally kind of work ourselves through as you see how the presentation is formatted. Okay, so just to revisit our strategic plan, we always start with our core values. And it's really impossible to do this work without continuously reminding ourselves of what our values are, and does our work and decisions align with the values that we have represented from the work from our community. So we are committed to our whole child That means academics and beyond. We believe in growth, ownership, and continuous improvement. I think tonight's work is going to be a great demonstration of that. We believe in communication and collaboration, again, leaning into two-way communication, as well as including voice across all stakeholder groups. Number 4, we believe in diversity and equity. Diversity is an outcome of what we have already made up in our community, but how do we organize that within our schools? And how do we really embrace equity in terms of helping all students achieve success in our different schools and programs? And then lastly, that partnership and stewardship, really talking about some of our fiscal responsibility to our taxpayers and our community. And we will highlight some of those things tonight. So then looking into goal area number 1, this was really focused on student growth and achievement. We've talked a lot about this in terms of our curriculum. Throughout this year, we have focused a lot on our math. We've given you early previews as to what is coming in terms of ELA. We've really started to dig in deeper around our assessment system and how we utilize that to inform our work, as well as highlighting our early learning and prioritizing that within our school district. Goal number 2 is really a partner goal to goal number 1, where we talk about including making an inclusive learning environment. This also reflects our core values around that diversity and equity and really ensuring that all students are included. This aligns to how do we get down to the individual student level, providing them interventions, supports, differentiating their learning so they are really getting what they need. I think our schedule work that we are doing and have in place for next year is a great reflection of progress in those goal areas. We also look at our social emotional needs, again, embedded within our daily schedules, and then having ownership, engagement, voice, and choice specifically around our students and their learning. Goal number 3, family and community partnerships. This is one that we are kind of in the research phase in year 1 of our strategic plan, and we'll be delving more deeply into this in the coming years. So how do we really develop those partnerships with our community and our families and ensure that we have, again, that two-way communication? So we have input, but we also have clarity around what is happening in the district from the classroom level to the school level to the district level and the board. We really want to engage with our community as partners in this work, and that is something that we really value. I think that is something that the board has demonstrated in their transparency, providing the live stream for our board meetings and the clarity of communication that comes out around our board. So lastly, we're going to look at goal number 4. This is our stewardship of resources. And again, this is where we actually highlight equity across schools. And you'll see why that falls under this category of goals as we go through the data. So we're really looking at not only our financial resources, but also our human capital. How do we hire personnel? How do we align them within our schools and programs to ensure that we have the best resources for the students based on their needs? So really taking a deep look at our school-based funding and expenditures. That's something that we will highlight tonight, and ensuring that we are constantly doing the work that we do to the highest quality possible, but within our means. And that is something that I believe, again, our board is really committed to as part of being financial stewards for our community. Okay, so just a quick recap, because I know we like to revisit for people who are jumping into the conversation for the first time. This dates back to fall of 2019, when we really began our strategic planning process with our community and stakeholder groups. Then into 2021, beginning to look at our internal equity audit, and then moving outwards to engage with our equity audit from DM group. And then that led us to partnering for our dual language program review as well. That takes us into summer and fall of 21, which seems like about 10 years ago, but it was just this last fall where we really conducted that work to get some outside expertise, some research-based criteria on how we evaluate and identify areas of need and areas of celebration within our system. And then winter and spring of 22, that is where we are currently heading out of. We presented those results in a former committee of the whole meeting, and then really looking at how we engage our community around building awareness around our data and the results from those audits. So again, just highlighting our equity opportunity review, our dual language program evaluation, as well as our enrollment and facility utilization analysis that was conducted by Crapper. Tonight, as we look at the data and we start identifying some of our research-based targets, that a lot of that came out of research and work with Cropper as well. And we continue to partner with them as we look at some of our more specific infrastructures across our district. So just some examples of how we've educated and engaged our community and stakeholders. So obviously we've had many conversations throughout our time together this year at the board level. We held a town hall. We have done video messages. We have done written messages. I've had the opportunity to work with our PTO, FTO leadership team, our administrative team, and ensuring that we're all on the same page as they engage their families at the school level to make sure that we're all aware of where we are, what does equity mean, what are our goals, what are the visions of the strategic plan. And then moving on. Oh, did you? No, we are not. Yeah, sorry. If you'd like to go back and watch the video, you are welcome to. All videos are available on our district website. Okay, so in recap, that now leads us to our more significant area of focus. It was one of our areas of focus for this year. It will continue to be a lens through which we do all of our work for the remaining 4 years of our strategic plan. So this really, truly is a journey. It's taking us from where we started to hopefully leading us to where we want to go. And so tonight we want to, we can proceed to the next slide, is to just redefine what does equity mean. Now this is the visual and I love it, and we're going to keep using it repeatedly because I think it really drives the point home around what does equity mean to us. So we start with inequality, right? One child's getting what they need, one child's not. Then we give both children the same things. And again, one child is benefiting, another child may not. Then we get to equity, where we differentiate and we can provide different supports in order to access what each child needs. And then our ultimate goal, and this, kind of is equity 2.0 leading to justice. If you look, it's not that the ladders are different in this, it's that the tree itself is different. And I want the board to really look and absorb that so we can focus our work tonight on the system itself. We as a district organization have control over certain things within our system. And that's what we have the ability to change over time based on our students' needs. So our tree cannot always lean to one side. Sometimes we have to straighten it out. Sometimes we have to plant some new trees too. So moving on from that, we want to focus on what is our impact as a board and leadership team that we have across our system. And there's 2 areas that we're going to focus on. So one, we're going to focus on in terms of what we can do. And the other one is knowing what we have that we don't necessarily have control over. So when we look at our systemic impact, we have control as a board through our policies, through our governance, and then through our leadership around the practices that we put in place around our school boundaries, for example, and also our school organization and our structures. So how do we organize our schools according to grade levels? How do we organize our schools with the various class sizes across each of our schools? And then sections. And when we say sections, that's educational terminology for classes, right? So if we have, if we have 50 second graders at a particular school, we might section them in 2 classes of 25. So those are the things that we have impact and control on as a governing team for our district. But we also have to recognize what we do not have control over, what we can sometimes influence, but what makes up our community and whom are we trying to serve? So we have student demographics, which we would never change and we would never want to change. We have our district boundaries and our infrastructure. So the defined borders of District 59 are defined within Illinois state law, not something we as a board have power over, as well as our infrastructure. Where are there industrial areas? Where are there residential areas? Where are there multi-home? Where are there single family homes? Those are types of things. What businesses are in our communities? We don't have control over those pieces. And then lastly, we have compliance because we are a government funded organization. So we have compliance that we have to adhere to by Illinois state law as well as federal regulations. And we'll review some of those compliance pieces as we look at our data. So I'm hoping that the board is really going to be able to keep ourselves on the left side of that screen and not let ourselves move over and start talking about those things that are really outside our control. So the first pause point we're going to have is to ask our board members who are with us this evening, what areas of our school system do you think are important when thinking about equity in District 59?
To me, the first thing is learning. And that's the most important thing. That's what you're doing, is learn.
Yeah, I would add to that that I think it's very critical that we get to the point or that we continue to strive toward the goal that 80% of our students are being met by the core curriculum.
Can we go back to the previous page?
And it's obvious that we can't teach everybody the same way because there are different situations that have to be met. But everybody's situation has to be met one way or another. To me, that's the whole idea of equity.
So I look at the within our control, and I think it's a great slide to look at. That we can control where kids go to school, how we organize the schools, and how we manage that. And how we manage that is how do we best educate the kids with what you said, with be learning. We want to make sure that 80% of our kids are basically in that tier 1 level of education. And we're not there yet. We know that. But whatever we do and what we ever do is how do we get to that place where we are at that? And I want to look at this from a perspective of how do we do it this time and we get it right and it's flexible for the future going forward. Because as we know, there are things beyond our control, which are also listed here too. Our student demographics. Students move. Dr. Shagan and I are talking about, how Elk Grove families are starting to, the elderly families are starting to move out and younger families are starting to move in. So we don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years as those families move in and they bring potentially kids in the district. So I think the true equity is learning. Kids want 80%. We also want to build something that's flexible. So every kid going forward, and we have that flexibility going forward so that in 15 years, the district's not doing this again. I think that's kind of where I want to be at.
What do you mean when you say district boundaries? What exactly
well,
does it mean?
Our district boundaries end at Devon Avenue. They end at Highway 53. They end up at, don't forget to turn your mic on, Mardell.
In other words, you're not talking.
No, there's two
sorry.
different things. We have school boundaries, which we can control.
Yeah,
But we have our district boundaries.
district boundaries we cannot control.
We cannot control where,
Correct.
we
Yeah.
butt up against District 25. We butt up against District 57. We butt up
Right.
against District, 57. So we can't change those boundaries. We have our distinct boundaries of the area that we encompass. But
I
we
think
can control our
that
school boundaries.
within our own boundaries, we have made some really wise decisions over the years. They haven't been happy. A lot of people have been involved on committees working to straighten them out. But if we have way too many people in one junior high area, and we are able to move some of them who are close to one of the other areas so that they are moved as a group rather than just pulling out certain people, we have done that and it's been very successful. In other words, if Grove is too big and Holmes has an area that's close to the Elk Grove area, Grove area, we've been able to move somebody over to Holmes, et cetera. And I think that's something that we should look at if we have to, because it's moving groups of people, not just a few people, so that they're still with friends and so forth, and they're not that much further on the bus one way or the other.
So when thinking about the question in terms of what are those areas, so what I'm hearing you say, Mardell, is looking at our boundaries, looking at balance across our schools, right? And then I heard Randy, you talking about that flexibility and almost that sustainability over time, looking into the future. Any other key areas that the board thinks is important when looking at equity?
I do think that we need to think about, with our dual language programs, having economies of scale in terms of being able to get the benefit of those linguistic supports and the collaboration between teachers. And I think one place for me that I want to continue to dialogue about this group about is how do we balance achieving those economies of scale with not creating our own de facto segregation where we have all of our multilingual students in little pockets and then all of our native English speakers at other schools, but finding that right mix where we all are able in District 59 to share in the benefits of diversity, but also making sure our multilingual students are as well resourced as well as their teachers being as well resourced as they can.
So I would just add to Randy's point of being adaptable, not just to how our demographics within our district change, but also how our students change with time. Students in 5 years are going to learn differently than students today. I've seen this in my career, right? College students from 10 years ago are different from college students today. And so we need to be able to adapt resources to address student needs as part of that equity, where we're looking at students may come in with different skills to begin with and have different gaps. And so we need to be able to adapt our programs to that. Alongside that, making sure that our standards for that 80% remain high, right? So it's not just 80% are tier one, but our tier one is low. No, 80% is compared to the nation as a whole. 80% are achieving that high level. The other issue is making sure we're not just patching every single place and being efficient with resources. Towards your point, if we had every single program at every single school, we run into the issue of that spreads our resources too thin and doesn't let us do economies of scale, as you said. And it's maybe for short term, the right thing to do to fix things next year, but longer term to manage the stewardship of our taxpayer dollars, we need to use these resources efficiently. And so we need to make sure we're balancing that as well.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, and this is going back to my facilities days, is that we're also using our facilities properly too. We have some great facilities. If depending on what we do, we want to make sure that those facilities are being used to what they're meant to be used for. Whether it be, wherever a cluster is at, whatever school we do or whatever happens, that we look at using our resources of our schools that'll best fit the student needs that are in that school. So, I think it's more than just an equity of the students, it's the equity of the resources, economies of scale, and our facilities.
I don't really know what you mean.
Well,
The resources that are in a particular school, what
Right.
aren't we using?
well, we want to make sure that, for example, the Rupley, the ELA, what's it, the kids are moving to
ELS program.
ELA program, we're moving to Juliet Low, correct? Or
We are?
No, we're moving our junior high
junior
from Grove to Holmes, our ELS program.
our
Okay.
ELS program
Yeah.
as we move from. So I want to make sure that if we're moving that Holmes has the necessary facilities to accommodate them.
Correct.
I've heard of stories of what's happening in District 54 where they're moving their ELS program to another school where they don't have, the bathrooms aren't up to a code for that. And I don't want that to have to happen with us. I want to make sure that if we're moving a group of students to a school and they have certain needs, I want to make sure that school has the facilities available to accommodate those needs of those kids.
And I don't think it should be just the principals speaking. I think it should be teachers speaking about what they're doing too with it, because I'm not sure the principal knows as many of the different things as the teachers do.
Well, I think that's where equity of voice is important. So as we move on, Daisy, did you have anything to add? I don't want to.
Well, I'm not sure if this actually goes with this, but coming from a voice of a single parent, everything starts at home. So if if something, we give everything to the student, but if something is not actually right at home, I think we also need to provide the resources and all the information correctly to the parents in a way that they actually understand. Because like for me, like some words like compliance, I actually had to Google it to know what it meant. So I know that sometimes we are pretty transparent with parents, giving them the information, but sometimes the wording or when translating, it's not like very clear. So I think it all starts at home. So I think we also need to focus a little bit on the parents as well. That I don't know if it goes with that, but that's just
I
what
think it absolutely goes with it. It's a real, it's a factor that is outside of our control, but something that we have to be aware of in order to accommodate and to help move us forward. So I think that's a really valid point.
And to that point, I would say supporting our staff and teachers equitably as well, right? Based on what they're dealing with in their particular situation, making sure that our resources that support them are used properly as well.
Okay, so I think you hit almost all of the ones. We're going to go to our next slide, and we're going to give you the categories that we feel we've gotten some data on, and then share that with you tonight. So the next slide, we talked about student outcomes. That was number one. Mardell and Courtney both mentioned that. What are our students learning, and how are we measuring it? Then we talked about programming, our programming for our English learners, programming for special education, programming for our gifted and talented programs, and everything else in between. Looking at school enrollment and our demographics, where students go to school, and is that balanced amongst our community so that we are not creating unintentional segregation, and we are embracing our diversity, which is a core value, back to our original slide. Looking at class size and sections, so how do we have an equitable experience as a student? If I'm in a class of 9 to 12, it might be very different than a class of 28 to 32. And how do we create that sustainability and predictability within that to ensure equity for our students? We spoke to facility capacity and usage, not only from how much of our building is utilized for educational purposes, but is our building capable of the type of learning that our students need to do? And that's going to be a question that we're going to have to study further. Resource allocation, which we absolutely talked about as well, both financial and personnel. How do we staff? Where do we staff? How do we ensure that students get what they need in an equitable manner and not just an equal manner across our schools? And then one piece that I think Courtney spoke to this as well, it's kind of an unintended outcome, is that when we move students, we create changes in transportation times where students have to travel to get to the program that they need. So we definitely want to look at that tonight. And so each of these areas, we are going to dig in a little deeper with some very specific data. So we will kind of group them together, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions. So with that, we are going to go into our student outcome. And again, I'm going to remind us of our preface before. This is to talk about our current reality, so that we can learn, we can celebrate, and we can build a path forward. This is not any type of judgment around where we are. And I want to be very sensitive to that, because when we talk about individual school data, that feels very personal. And so I want to make sure that we're doing this with the true intention of improvement and equity for all students as a district. So with that, I will turn it over to, I believe, Tom.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. And yes, I'll kick things off on the student outcomes. Appreciate that. That was the number one thing to hear from the board. And really the focus on that KPI goal of the 80% target, that tier 1 target, the 25th percentile and above, that we can service at least 80% of our kids in that manner. And when we can't, we have a system in place to support those students. And I really do appreciate Dr. Bresnahan's comment, because I was reflecting on how often we shared building data in this type of environment. Very rare, because of the concern of how a school could be perceived, or a community, or a group. But the time is right to really look. This is the reality of the district, and it's perfect for this conversation. So this next slide is where we stand today after our spring benchmarking period in regards to our 80%. On the left-hand side, you have math for our 11 elementary schools, and then the 3 junior highs. On the right, reading. You can see there's quite a range in performance. One thing I do want to highlight, something we realized after the winter sharing that we were including district special ed programs in school data. So like Rupley or Friendship or Grove or Low, we've extracted those groups of kids. So this data reports the standard K-5 elementary or standard 6-8 because we know our district programs service kids from throughout the district. So you can see on the math side, we have quite a range. The district result is at 64% for elementary, 63% for the junior high. And you can see how they fall across those areas in math. And then in reading, 65% at the elementary level, 69% in reading at the junior high level.
In this next portion, we're going to look at 4 different District 59 programs: our multilingual services, special education, talent development, and early learning. And when we discuss equity in programming, 2 of our very important targets are listed here. One is that our systems allow accurate identification of student needs, and those practices allow for representation of all students in our programming. And the second is that programming is reasonably accessible to any student who needs to access it. So we are going to start with special education and take a look at the makeup of students' race and ethnicity for those receiving special education services within our district. So what we would want to see here is that our racial and ethnic groups are similar to our district racial and ethnic groups. So you'll see in that first line, we have all students within our district and the breakdown of race and ethnicity. And then in the second row, we have students with IEPs and the breakdown of race and ethnicity. You can see we have an overrepresentation of students receiving special education services who are Black, Hispanic, and 2 or more races, and an underrepresentation of students who are white, Asian, and Native American. Another way we can look at programming is to look at where services are provided, which we'll do next with multilingual services. Mrs. Savage?
We've spoken quite a bit this year through our dual language audit, but we can take a look right now at the current status of where students are being served with multilingual services. So ESL services, so English language learning services with an ESL resource teacher, are provided at all schools except for BIRD. Students who are not in the dual program, who reside in the BIRD boundary that need EL services, go to Claremont. We have Spanish dual language one way at BIRD, Brentwood, John Jay, Juliet Low, Frost, Rupley, and Salt Creek. And we have our 2-way, as we call it, at John Jay, Juliet Low, and Salt Creek. We have one Polish dual language location, Claremont, and we have ESL and Spanish dual language at all 3 of our junior highs. Here we can see another data set that shows us the percentage of students receiving multilingual services across our district. So if we look at our district average of 51% receiving services, we can see the span of the highest right there, Rupley at 66%, down to Ridge at 28%. Our junior highs as well, you can see it's a little bit more evenly divided, and we have the district average at 34% with ranges between 30 and 37. Now we're going to take a look at our talent development program current status. Similar to what we looked at with special education, if you look at the very bottom row, you can see the district overall percent of students in each demographic group. And then where it says right above grades 3 to 5 TDP, that's the percent of students within that demographic group that is receiving TDP services. So you can see where we might be over and under representing across different areas. We also have each building's breakdown that you can take a look and you can see where we land there as well.
Just a general question. They're all divided up into different groups. How different are each of the different groups? Because many of those groups, as long as they can all speak the same language, should have a lot of similarity. Am I right or wrong?
There's a lot of similarities across all of our students, I would say, children in general.
Mhm.
The reason why we look across specific demographic groups is specifically to ensure that we have equity across our schools.
So basically, if we assume that we have a very good adaptable curriculum, it should handle most of our students.
That's that 80% KPI, Mardell, right? So regardless of your demographics, our target is at that 80%. If there are significant special needs, that obviously
Obviously, that's
requires some more specialized, individualized instruction. But in terms of looking at our student body as a whole, and that's why it's so important to ensure that we're looking at data this way so that we don't miss any groups, because perhaps it is our curriculum that is the issue. Perhaps it is our structure or our settings. And that's when we have these variances and overrepresentation or underrepresentation. That's when we have to start asking ourselves the question, why?
And I think that's smart because
Mhm.
obviously our grades were not what we expected them to be the last time we saw them. And we have to know why. And it can't all be because we are all different, because that's not a good excuse. I don't know what the answer is, but
Often when we see over or under representation, it leads us back to those two key targets that we talked about at the beginning of this programming piece, which is how are we identifying students, and are those practices equitable and without bias, and how are we providing the services, and are those services then accessible to all? So sometimes that level of data can then point us back to those two practices that we do have control over, how we identify and how we provide. So one other aspect of programming is our early learning, which we know is a huge leverage point for our learners when they can access early intervention and early learning. One of the aspects to consider with our Early Learning Center is proximity to the ELC. And you can see here that students in close proximity to the ELC in terms of their attendance center and their boundaries are more likely to attend, or there's a correlation between proximity to the ELC and attendance for early learning. So with all of these programming data points for multilingual services, for special ed, for talent development, and with early learning, we want to make sure that we are equitably identifying students, providing reasonable access to needed programming that then meets the needs of all of our learners. So questions or comments about programming?
Yep. So programming and around those student outcomes, that's the section. So that was a lot of data just presented. So if we want to engage in some clarification, data questions that you might have, and again, it's asking questions of why, and we can hypothesize and begin to look at why those things exist. But it starts with knowing the data and understanding where those discrepancies are.
So could we scroll back to the TDP slide? So the one that jumps out as me as just unreasonably discrepant is the Hispanic category, which represents 42% of our district. And yet we have 26.8 who are being identified for TDP. And then we see in the Asian category and the white category, there's an inflated number of students getting identified versus the average percentage. So I guess it leads me to ask the questions, what is the process by which we identify these students? Is there a linguistic barrier? Because we know that a large percentage of our Hispanic students may speak a second language at home. So is there a linguistic barrier in how we're testing the students to give them access to TDP?
I think the question I have, and is it consistent across schools how kids get selected for TDP as well too?
Yeah.
I like to add that question onto that too.
So it is consistent across schools, how we identify for TDP. Traditionally, over the years, it is through first data analysis through whatever data set we're looking at right now. It's iReady and COGAT in 2nd and 4th grade. In the last couple of years, the TDP group under the leadership of Dr. Robinson and Mrs. Briggs have looked for other ways to more equitably identify students, and that has begun. So now we use what is called as the HOPE scale. That is a teacher recommendation tool that is broader in an equitable lens, where it asks a variety of questions around perseverance, motivation, academic skills that a student might possess that would allow them to be identified in advance of just looking at the data, so that we're looking at the top 25% of a cohort of students. In addition, they've decided in the last couple of years, we've gone to local norming so that we are getting a more accurate representation within our district boundaries. So we have begun to make some changes. So these numbers, we are hoping, are going to continue to evolve. We also know that we have more room to grow and areas to look at with our TDP program. In terms of the language barrier, for the COGAT assessment, there's subcategories of assessment. And in the one area that is the verbal component, there is a language scaffold that is built into the assessment, as well as extra time, but it is in English, so that could potentially provide some barriers. So we do have a lot of room to grow, but we've begun to take some steps in this area.
And I just want to point out one thing. You said we may be over-representing certain categories. That may not be true. It may be that we're underrepresenting that category, and if that total goes up in that column, the other percentages go down to where they should be without removing people in the other columns. Does that make sense?
No.
Yeah, I think that's a really, Dr. Sager, that's such an important point, not only for this slide, but for a lot of slides that we look at. It is not about selecting less students who are white and Asian. If they qualify and we are using a rigorous selective identification process, then that is the true number.
Thank you.
But what it means is that we need to find a more equitable way on how we identify students who have specific language needs, or what is it in our programming or our curriculum leading up to second grade that may be putting other students at a disadvantage. That is such a key point around equity work, because I use it is not pie. We don't only have so much TDP available. We have TDP available for all students who qualify based on our identification process. The same thing for special education. We don't currently have that for early learning because we're limited in our resources. But the same thing for our English learners in varying degrees on how we meet that. I think that's just such a critical point for us to keep in mind when we're looking at this data.
So I think a follow-up question I have to that then, because the TDP and then our students who might qualify for IEP or special services fall outside the rubric of our 80%. But like what I'm hearing is that if, for example, the students that qualify for TDP grow to a larger number, we are open to that growth. It might eventually lead to a change in our core curriculum, right? If we're finding that more and more, I guess I'm just trying to understand how these impact each other. Because if you just say that TDP is not a certain piece of the pie, then I would think it could grow large enough to exceed.
It could, but I think the other is qualifying criteria, right? So even, for example, with special education, if we started to see over 20% of our students beginning to be identified for special education, that would trigger us to say we have an identification issue. So for example, what we're doing around localizing our norms in order to qualify students for the program, that is a stopgap measure until we get greater balance. But if we truly looked at criteria, rigorous criteria around gifted and talented, as it is designed by research base, we should achieve equity and we should remain within a range of our students. Does that make sense? Katie, I know you want to jump in, add to it.
I would also just add that if we see large groups of students trending anyway for any reason, we would always then take that information to adjust our core, right? So the same goes for intervention. If we see large groups of students needing the same intervention, we know that there may need to be a tier 1 adjustment. So that is possible, and that's important data that we see when we have large changes, large groups, or data that's trending in a certain direction over time.
And that's why this is so fluid. This is a snapshot of time, right? And so we have to do this all the time. We are looking at this all the time. We're not presenting it all the time to the board per se, but when we are looking programmatically on how we serve students and how we resource for our programs, these are the things that we are responsible for looking at on a regular basis, because we want to keep that balance. We want to ensure that we have rigorous systems and that we have the equity across our identification for these programs.
So can I clarify the grades 3 to 5 TDP? What fraction of the total students is that? Is it 10%? What?
It's about 250 of that grade cohort of about 1,800 kids.
14%, 15%.
13 point.
Oh, I was so good.
Pretty good. So
It's 254.
So that gray bar.
Right. So we
is-
don't begin TDP until third grade.
Yeah, so
so,
that-
that's why it's just
that,
amongst
that
those.
dark gray bar in the picture here is 14% of students. That the imbalance in the columns, we can correct that not by removing certain students, but by enlarging that pool for certain columns, and then the percentages will readjust themselves. But it would be 16% of students or something like that instead. We're probably not identifying people that should be in TDP.
Right.
So my question is, if we do what Dr. Sager says, we kind of look at, making it more inclusive, can we handle additional students in the program to a point where, how much can we, grow the program to satisfy the student needs as we identify more students?
That's why we review resources on a regular basis based on student needs, and it should be flexible. Because if we begin looking at our TDP program and it is growing at a genuine, authentic rate, then yes, we would look at getting more staff or resources to support those students. I mean, absolutely. And there's different models based on the size of your programs. So we would begin to explore that. Absolutely.
Because I'm just looking at how we've seen our math scores went from what we did last year, like the fall to the winter benchmark, how we improved. I'm like, okay, we keep doing that a couple more times, 3 or 4 times. We're gonna have a lot more kids qualifying for TDP, which I have no problems against, but I want to make sure that we can make sure that the kids that do qualify
Get the services.
get that ability, so that when they get further on in their education, that they're farther ahead.
Absolutely. So part of what I'm doing, just as you know, throughout this presentation, as we have these discussions, at the end, we're really going to hopefully walk away with what are the board's priorities that they want us to look at further in order to address. And hopefully that these will come out naturally through our conversation, but that's kind of the end result that I will be looking for. So clearly there's a lot of interest around these pieces and our program identification and ensuring that those are included in our strategic plan work.
So I guess before we move on from this slide, I'm just interested in pointing out too that although the numbers of our Hispanic population are a much higher percentage than the other categories, we do see that same discrepancy with Native American, Black, multiracial. So I am interested in the discrepant groups that fall beneath what their average percentage would be.
You have to be careful with the size of the population in each group, because the statistical error becomes bigger than what we're trying to look at. And so,
Yeah, because for example, like 4% represents one student in some of these cases. So we get into the nuances, but again, if the goal is let's grow towards equity, that's a priority, and then we can do that. I think that's important.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Terry, is what are we doing wrong, or what should we do more of that's right, or something like that. And I think over the years on the different committees that I have served on with various administrators in charge and different focuses on each committee, the one thing that I've seen that we're not doing the best job at is working with our parents. I don't think we're working with our parents enough, especially the Hispanic parents, because a lot of them I have heard at committee meetings or even just in conversation saying, I wish that I knew more English so I could help my children with their homework. Well, if they can't help their children with their homework, that doesn't mean they don't want to. It's just that they need more help. And yes, the District 214 and the villages and so forth offer this, but maybe we should do more Daisy and I, when we first met each other on the board here, we were going to work on teaching Hispanic parents how to speak English so they could help their children. We never got around to it. And then I thought about doing it myself over at Bird because I thought I could do it after school and maybe even use a 4th or 5th grader as my Hispanic interpreter as I taught English. But however we do it, I think we should do more of it because I think there are parents who want to learn, really want to learn English. And I don't think we're offering enough possibilities for them to do it. In fact, I would even be willing to do something like that this summer if I thought that we could fit it in at one of our schools. I'd be happy to go over there. And
So we're going to pause on some solutions for now, but I appreciate your input, Mardell, for sure. So we're going to go on. Oh, yeah. Oh, another question. Sorry.
I want to go back to the, can you go back couple to the programming current status? There we go. So can you expand more on the ELS, the first bullet point of ELS services, all except Bird? So we have a dual language program at Bird. We don't have ESL services. So if a student qualifies for ELS services, they're going to Claremont.
So students qualify for different services through their identification as English learners.
Okay.
So there could be a qualification for full-time services, which is our dual language program, or they could qualify for part-time services, or they could decline full-time services and request part-time services, which are our ESL. And so, yes, that is how our current system is set up. Susan, is there anything more to that?
It's actually been like that for a very long time, and I don't have a full rationale for why that occurred and maintained at Bird. But it was brought to my attention this year as I began to get involved in our multilingual program in this position, and it was definitely an outlier in that regard.
Do you know approximately how many students are in that
Your
category of going from Bird to Claremont?
I do not know off top of my head. I've talked to Mr. Gannon about it a little bit, but I don't know the number. I could look into that and find that to just see.
So I think this is one of the things that we want to work on from an equity perspective.
Yes, because this is something we have control over. But back to Courtney's original point of economies of scale, how do we allocate resources and not spread ourselves so thin, right? So this is a balancing act right now in how we address this, because we have students who qualify for services at varying levels. We have students that accept services or decline services. And then we have students who choose our two-way dual. And all of that is part of this balancing act on this screen that you see here.
And real quick, jumping over to the right column versus the left column, do those options you laid out, are those compliance, like that we are required to say you have these four
Yes.
options?
If you qualify for services, providing full-time and part-time services for students who qualify for language services is required by law. We are not required by law to have a two-way dual. That is a district's option and choice.
But what about the option you mentioned of you qualify for full-time, but you choose part-time? Are we required to make that option available?
Yes.
Can we go down one more slide then? Yeah, that one. That's the one. Go up one. So I'm looking at the multilingual enrollment is at 51% of the district for the elementary, but then as a junior high, it's 34%. So is that as kids basically grow out or have tested their?
They gain English proficiency.
They gain their English proficiency, so that's a difference.
Which is natural. That should be the case.
Claremont School, for example, is 48% multilingual. Does that mean that 48% of the population is in the Polish program?
That is the only dual language program that's offered there. And the ESL services for students, for example, that move over from Bird. So that's encompassing of all of
And
those
would be
students.
the Hispanic ELL.
For ESL,
Mhm.
yes, those would be our Spanish speaking students.
And why are they moving over there from Bird?
That is the question that we
we
I don't
don't
have
know
history
why.
on.
I believe, as Susan said, it's a historical, and the number has been quite small, I believe. 10 kids, 7 kids, something along that.
It could have
path
been
over
an
time.
economy of scale where
Well,
there were ESL
go.
resources, provided. Same reason why dual language students from other schools go over there. Any other questions? Yes,
I'd
Dr.
like to
Sager.
move back to the special ed. I would just like to ask, can we get some more detail of what goes into determining students who have an IEP? Is it specific disabilities for learning, behavior? What goes into that?
So we have a process for students who may be in need of services related to a disability. In fact, upon looking at this data several years ago, Dr. Degree and her team really went back and with a fine-tooth comb looked at all of our eligibility criteria and processes for all disability categories. So if you remember to our special ed presentation last month, we have 14 different disability categories. There's eligibility criteria for each one of those. And so they went back through and did a massive review of how that criteria is set for our district, why it is set that way with our legal team, with our special ed practitioners, to make sure that there was consistency within that process. But yes, that is a very specific and detailed process that occurs with an evaluation for each student that determines if they have a disability and if that disability adversely impacts their education, in which case they would qualify for services, and then we would put their IEP in place.
Thank you.
Okay. So we are going to shift gears now and we're going to start talking about school enrollment and demographics. I'll turn it over to Tom.
All right. So a few things. First of all, these targets we're utilizing, we recently had a follow-up meeting with Cropper in regards to enrollment projections and looking for some suggestions and recommendations from them on our work as we move forward and really push them for some standards. Especially in relation to elementary schools. So they shared 300 is a number from their perspective in the districts they've worked with in regards to the minimum size of an elementary school. And then also shared that a demographic 15 percentage points from the district average is an area to focus on. We did ask a few questions related to that. And I think most of that is connected to suburban districts similar to ours where there's a higher population. They did share when they work with, there are districts they work with out west that, there are 300 kids in the district across a wide range and variety of area and things like that. But this allows for, you have some, as the word's been used a few times, economy of scale in regards to how you organize those classrooms and sections. And then that, realistic view of the range for demographics.
And I think to that point also, it adds to what we talked about earlier around flexibility within a school. When you get under that 300 number, you lose some flexibility in terms of how you place students. So
Can I ask a quick question? I'm not at the question time. Should I wait for the question time of this section? Okay.
Absolutely
the
not.
One piece I'm wondering if we're getting from Cropper, and it's something Randy had observed earlier about Elk Grove. I'm observing it about Juliet Lowe's neighborhood, that a lot of the original first-time homeowners are now, there's finally a second owner to the home. And so there's a pretty growing population of young families who I expect will be elementary school students potentially. So I'm wondering if Cropper's going to do a piece about extrapolating out those demographics.
Yeah, that's what we've actually, Dr. Bresnan has been really pushing them for an enrollment projection at least 5 years out. I know they've struggled with census data, the newest census data to inform that they keep waiting for it. It hasn't been published that they can access, but they'll use that data to help produce that piece. And we're hopeful to have that sometime this summer.
And then I had a question for these numbers, the 300 students, the plus or minus 15 percentage points. these are things that are within our control towards, right? It's our guidance really, right? Okay.
Correct. We asked for what do they look at as they work with school districts. They shared this piece, and we're sharing that tonight to help us frame that conversation around enrollment and demographics. So this next slide, and just to quickly, it's likely that this is not the exact data today in all of our schools. We're focused and utilizing the fall housing report. That's data that goes off to the state. It's part of the school report card. It's the data we shared with Cropper. We wanted to maintain that consistency, especially when something gets published on the school report card in the fall. So for all those principals out there who are going to call me tomorrow and say, my numbers are off a little bit, we know that already, but that's on purpose. So these are elementary and junior high schools. You can see as an average, we're at 329 as a district. That ranges from 250 to 429, 179 students between those two schools. When you slide over to the junior high, our average is 651, but you can see when you get down to three schools how that average can be skewed. 452 to 883, that's 431 students. You can see then how grade levels fall. We are seeing, our grade levels, probably 5th through 8th grade are a little higher than those totals at the primary grades, although you see spikes throughout each grade level.
Tom, on the last four schools, Devonshire, Claremont, Salt Creek, and Brentwood,
Yes.
their totals are affected how much by the Polish program at Claremont, the Hispanic program at another school, et cetera?
I think all schools, one way or another, are greatly affected by programming decisions that have been made historically by the district. Whether it's Claremont because they have, I think, 150 students who are bused into the school based on the Polish bilingual, or at the same time, kids who are bused out to don't attend their neighborhood school because those bird students who qualify for ESL who are put on a bus to go to Claremont. So I think all schools are impacted in that way, some more than others. I think the higher enrollments, you're absolutely right, are impacted by programming decisions.
And we're going to review that slide with those impacts and our totals in about 15 slides. So
In 3 hours.
all right, I am talking about this one. Sorry. So board policy, again, when we talk about compliance, what is required by law? This was new. We brought this up last fall because this is a new board policy that we have where we are required every year to ensure that we are looking at our schools for disproportionality across demographics. And when we talk about demographics, we're talking about race, ethnicity, we're talking about socioeconomic status. So all of those things are important for us to look at on an annual basis. So we've always known it's the right thing to do. Now by law, we're required to do it. So it gives us, I think, the board a little more support in terms of this work and why we do it.
I think you bring up a good point, and then kind of one thing about the districts is, I think there was said earlier about the infrastructure and stuff like that. We can't control where apartments are at. We can't control where housing's at. We can't control where industry's at. And I think that's something that we have to be cognizant of as we're looking at this whole thing. Is like, we can't tell people where to live, and who lives there. So I think kind of goes back to my things like we know these areas, or at least we're familiar with these areas and what's happening in these areas. We need to look at it from our perspective of how do we ensure that any changes within that area we're going to be able to account for and plan for going forward.
So, and that is that's such a great point, Randy, because what it causes us to do is we have to be responsive to the changes within our community. And when we have that task and that ownership, what we have to build is a system that is sustainable, so that we are not doing massive changes on an annual basis. If you remember the slide that Tom put together for us, the last 40 some years of changes with programs and boundaries, we don't want to be in that constant state. We want to have as much predictability built within as well as that sustainability. And that's going to be a primary priority for us as whatever solution we come back with is is it going to give us some of that long-term predictability and sustainability over time?
So our next slide, we're moving into the demographics. So these, again, based on that file housing report, are demographics at our elementary and junior high school. We're going to highlight a few of the larger demographic groups through the next few slides. So if we could move on. So this highlighted in blue, this is our Asian population across the district. You can see as a district, we're at 12%. The range is from 2% to 33%. Just to highlight kind of that outside that 15%, we drew a line that's a little expanded, I guess is the way I would say it. And we tried to use those throughout this demographic piece. But you can see how that works through at each school. And you can see the same at the junior high. The range is from 4 to 17%, and how that falls out in regards to our Asian race/ethnicity group. Okay, this is our Black or African American group. You can see this range, 4% for the district. We're at 1% to 10%. At the elementary school and at the junior high, we're at 2 to 6% with a 4% also average there.
I could just pause and highlight as you're looking at this. I'm glad Tom set this up for us to see the junior highs separately. As we see less range, a smaller range at our junior highs, that is largely due to the fact that they pull from a larger geographic region with a higher population of students. So you have the ability to balance out when you are pulling from those larger areas and servicing students in only a 3 grade level span. So that's one of the things that when you're looking at that model, like, why is that across at our junior highs, but not so much within our individual elementary schools?
Thank you. Our next group, our Hispanic group. So you can see the district rate, our average is 41%. Our range is 14% to 71%. And we have 5 schools that on each end, 3 on the lower end and 2 on the upper end that fall outside of that 15 percentage points from the average. This, and I had in my notes to highlight that also, Dr. Bresnahan, I think is a good example. One of our larger ethnicity race groups, when you look at the junior high, how you see that range is really right in there, 9 to 11 across 3 pretty large schools. And then our final group, our white group, the district average is at 39%. We have 2 groups, 2 schools on each end of that with a range of 11% to 78%. And then this is another good example for the junior high where that 39, you can see we're at 30 to 41 in regards to the range. And then finally, as part of the demographic piece, you know, we discuss it a lot, the low income status for our schools across the district. Our elementary average was 49%. You can see the ranges from 28 to 64 with a few schools on each end, 3 total, that fall at or outside of that 15% range. And then the junior high piece, these are individualized. All the others was the district average. These are individualized to elementary and junior high. And you can see how tightly aligned the middle schools are, the junior highs are to that average. I think that's where it'd be good to pause for questions.
Absolutely. So discussion by the board.
I think there's a slide later on, but each of our schools do not have the same type of capacity at them, do they, though?
We're going to get into that a little bit later because that's absolutely, we have to live within our current structures as well. We don't necessarily, Grove's capacity is much larger than Holmes. So therefore it is understandable that Grove has more students. And we see some of those same variances across our elementaries. So we have to look across every facet of this because the goal cannot be 300 if that puts one school at 90% capacity and one school at 50% capacity. We have to look across all of these layers simultaneously to create the ideal system.
So kind of the goal, like the kind of going back to the thing about, you know, minimum 300 students per elementary school. that may not be obtainable for some schools based on the size of the school. And correct?
All of our schools' capacity is well over 300.
Okay.
And we'll get to that in a little bit, but that is a good point to note.
All our schools could have what?
The capacity of each of our schools, the maximum number of students that they could have in our buildings are all over greater than 300.
I'm looking at the number. I think the lowest is 422.
So it seems to me across these slides, we have consistent outliers on one side or the other side. And Ridge and Forest View seem to kind of fall into a category together where they are I guess, less diverse, generally demographic from a perspective of race, from a perspective of socioeconomic status. And then I think on the flip side, Bird and Jay are more highly diverse, more diversity of economic status again. So I guess from a standpoint of equity, I would like to see us move towards a place where across the board, our schools are closer to the average and we're not having these like extreme outliers on either end, because I do think it's important to a sense of every individual student's sense of well-being. Am I drastically in the minority that I'm getting free and reduced lunch? Like, am I drastically in the minority that I speak a second language at home? Whatever that category might be, I would like students at all of our schools to feel like they have representation among their fellow students and among their staff.
Well, I think staff, you can do more to balance it out the way you want it. But for example, Ridge, we really don't have any choice as to what our population is at Ridge because they choose to go there. We don't put them there.
Right, except we make a choice as a district to offer the choice to go to
Right,
Ridge.
That's true. We'd have to just completely change our philosophy.
But I think I'll go back to saying, I think there will always be outliers though. And if you just example, if you look at the Asian demographics at Forest View, kind of goes back to the point of, we can't tell people where to live,
Right.
and we can't just all of a sudden decide to, well, because of this demographic, we don't want to move this number of kids, as Mardell pointed out, we just want to move a few kids over here for demographic purposes either, just to dream of our demographics. We have to look at, we kind of have to look at where we're at and do the best we can, I think is a key thing.
So I think this is a good point to talk about what are those things that are within our control that are creating these? And what are the things that are naturally happening that are outside our control based on where people choose to live, et cetera. So when we look, for example, you just mentioned, so Ridge is a school of choice. That we can see the results of our data based on that. When we look at Forest View, if we went back to our we don't need to go back there, Ross, it's a lot of slides back, but recall from our multilingual programming, Forest View does not have dual language. So if you reside within that boundary, you cannot go to and choose dual language or require those services by law. You cannot attend Forest View. So once again, back to Dr. Sager's statistics point, if I had more students on the other end, that percentage that we see that's so discrepant would be lower. So I think we have to look at what are we doing. This is my question that we talk about on a regular basis. What are we doing as a district that are creating these conditions?
Well, one thing I know that we have done, and I'm not saying one way or the other, but at least I hear this in my area, and that is that the Polish people who live in my area are upset because we are segregating the Polish, and they don't know why we're segregating the Polish.
Is the concept behind that comment that they're going to Claremont for the dual program.
Right, right.
See, and I do think that highlights for me like this conundrum, because I just made the statement, I'd like to see the representation across the board, but that runs in direct opposition to consolidating the resources, putting the dual language teachers at one school where they can benefit from interaction with each other. So, and to Randy's point, then you're also trying to build something that you don't cherry pick groups, because we never know how that might change and evolve.
The only other thing is we could look at what we did during the bilingual days when we said by 4th grade, 5th grade at the very latest, they should be out of any kind of an ELL class and into a general ed classroom. And I think that the children in the Polish program at Claremont are in it for 6 years, aren't they?
It goes through 5th grade,
Yeah.
correct?
And that didn't used to be our goal, was to get them into English speaking general ed classrooms.
So I think that's a great example of where we are responding to the community in changing our programs, because I am speaking from anecdotally, but the parents that I've spoken to who have chosen the Polish dual language very much value that opportunity for their kids to become proficient in reading and writing in both languages. And it's a different model, right? If we were just having proficiency in English, then I think the 4th grade might make sense. But
But it's take
we're
them
doing both.
6 years to do that. That's the point. That's
mean,
what the community is concerned with. They don't think it should take 6 years to get to that point.
So I think that's based on the research of language acquisition, and maybe it's part of the impetus is on us to keep educating the public of why that's.
I have a
time.
question leading to this. It's probably out of the topic right now, but so our dual for the Polish, it's up to what grade?
5th grade.
It doesn't go up to junior high like the Spanish.
No, it does not.
Because
Okay.
kids are already in good shape, both in Polish and in English.
But we have received, I think, questions on this point, and I guess I am wondering at this point, does the district have any plans to think about extending that into the middle school, or is that like, what is the status of that?
I know that was a question. I think right now it is a question of how do we best serve, do we have the resources to staff that through that level? And is that where we focus is that a priority area, or is that an optional extension, which it would be a great to have, but not a must have? And I think that's from my understanding, because then there's some choices that have to be made when you get to the junior high and you want to follow a dual language track. And then you also want to follow an acceleration path across, let's say, math, for example. We don't necessarily have the resources for both of those things to occur, or for schedules to be able to accommodate both. So when we're getting into that, now we're talking about choice as opposed to need. And that's a substantial difference that I think right now we are not in the best position, because we are not meeting the needs of those that we are required to by law. So how do we prioritize? I think is what it is. It would be amazing if we could offer all of that, if we could offer even beyond Polish. Those things would be amazing. When we are not creating the conditions for all students to get what they need in a based on required services, I think we have to start somewhere. And I think that's where we need to focus for now as we build this out, in hopes that then we could dream about what could be. I don't know. Ross, maybe do you have any more background around that? Okay, I think I captured it. And these are great questions. I mean, Lego robotics, we'd be offering that if we could, but how do we build it all in when we have these other priorities? And that's hopefully at the end of the strategic plan, we will be able to dream a little bit bigger.
I'll tell you more later.
Okay, then we will move on with class size and sections. As you saw in previous slides, a couple points. We saw how at the junior high, because they draw from a bigger boundary area, the same issues aren't happening. So for the next few slides, we will focus primarily at elementary. We've also started to see how this conversation is unfolding, in that the impact of one program here or one boundary here, or even something we can't control where students are living or where neighborhoods are aging or revitalizing, that impacts everything that we see here over the last 50 years. So it's exciting to take a look at it now to start planning ahead. So we're going to look at some target class size ranges. This comes from ISBE. Will publish all of the class sizes, and we want to have smaller class sizes in K1 and 2. We will talk about sections, and as Dr. Brejnahan reminded us, that means classes, but not classrooms physically. That means if I have an elementary school and I have a second grade, how many sections do I have? How many teachers? How many classrooms do I have? Do I have 1? Do I have 2? And then we're going to look at that per program. So if I have a second grade at my school with only 1 program and 2 teachers, that's the 2 or more sections target. That's great, because then you have a teaching partner. You can intermix the kids every few years. You can do different higher levels of collaboration and whatnot. And then, of course, as we shared, there are state compliance requirements. I'm going to highlight 2 of them for both bilingual classrooms and special education classrooms. Now, the first slide, we have a different color for your enjoyment. And it is not sorted top to bottom because we're looking across programs. So when you see a darker color yellow, that is showing that it's not able to hit a target. So for instance, if you look at our elementary schools on the left, these are the class size averages from just kindergarten through second grade. You can see at Admiral Byrd for the monolingual class, the average class size is 18.5. So that's higher than you would see the typical average. Look down to Salt Creek, 25.3. And then we have at Frost, 14.8. As you go to the right for dual language one way, we mentioned Forest View and Ridge earlier because they don't have those programs. So they're not impacted here. You see those ranges. And then you go to dual language two-way and we have even fewer schools. So what we need to start doing is looking at our K1-2 classes, our average class sizes, but not just as the whole school at that grade level, but the programs within the grade level. You can see the same thing for grades 3, 4, and 5 in the middle. And then on the far right, we saw this in our last presentation, but I felt it was worthy to put here as we're now digging deeper. And those are those ranges from smallest to largest, from K5 across all of our elementary buildings. That range represents a span of 13 to 21, which is pretty significant. This next slide is going to talk about the sections. So if an elementary school has kindergarten through 5th grade, that's 6 levels. So if we had 2 sections per grade, we would look for a number of 12, because then every grade level within their program has a buddy. So the darker yellow here shows where we're not hitting that. At Admiral Byrd, there are 8 sections of monolingual. That means some grades have more than 1 section, some do not. Brentwood, they have 8. They do. They have enough so they can mix students up every couple of years. You can make new friends. You can have different experiences. Teachers are able to partner and team, troubleshoot, elevate their practice. When you get into the dual one-way, of course, it's going to be a little bit more limited because it's a program within the school. Two-way, even more so. If you look at a school like Salt Creek, John Jay, Juliet Low, that has all 3 programs, our 3 schools that have all 3 programs, Salt Creek's a good example of, we think of that as one of our moderately sized schools. But in a way, it's 3 schools within a school because by programming, they can't partner within programming. Now, our teachers do an amazing job of partnering and teaming across programming, and that is a strength that we, of course, want to keep. But as we talk about where are the growth areas, where we want to expand, That is the point of that slide on the left, or the chart on the left. Now, the next chart we're very proud of because this is a goal we've already solved. While we haven't crossed the finish line yet for year 5 of the strategic plan, this is a step in the right direction. The top numbers represent how many sections of multi-age were present. Those were at the schools at the top of the chart. Those were primarily in or in bilingual classrooms, and those have been eliminated. We staffed and we sectioned in a way that students will not be in a 3-4 multi-age of 34 students. And they also won't be in a class that's too small either. That doesn't provide us enough opportunities. We're starting to get closer to that now. The last 2 charts are probably pretty new to you. Some of these were new to me in the last couple of years. There are certain requirements from the state. The first I'll show you is the bilingual 90%. And that requirement is that the student-teacher ratio of a bilingual program classroom shall not exceed 90% of the average of the student-teacher ratio of the monolingual. And you can see we have a number of schools where that is not the case. And if you think of the class sizes and if you think of the sectioning we just learned about, that makes sense. Because some of our schools, they don't have any other option. I only have 1 class at first grade for monolingual, and I only have 1 class for bilingual. So there's no option to try to balance that out. On the far right, you'll see the same type of requirement for special education. And that requirement says that 70% of the students in that classroom should be without an IEP. And in this case, you see that we are much closer to compliance. Sometimes there are some spikes, as Mr. Reed has pointed out. Sometimes there are some of those outliers. But again, we lose opportunity when we don't have as many classes within a section to handle when those little surges or spikes come.
Sorry, I may have missed this, but when you said it's a ISBE requirement, it is a requirement versus a recommendation.
That is correct.
Okay.
It's a compliance item.
So for those of you out there, can you put this in a number effect? So let's say if there's 20 kids in a monolingual classroom, and then 18 would be the number for us to be in compliance in a bilingual. Anything under 18, we would be in compliance. Anything over 18, we're not in compliance. Okay.
Would you repeat that, Terry?
So the 90% rule. So if I have if my monolingual classrooms have an average of 20 kids per class,
20. Okay.
then at we take 90% of that would be 2 less students, 18. So our bilingual classrooms must be 18 or lower in order to be in compliance.
Okay, I get it.
So if we go back a slide where you see the K1 class sizes, for example, you can see that we have some of our dual language classes that have higher class sizes than the ones on the right on the left on average.
So what is the implication of being out of compliance on one of these?
I think the most important one is that we know that we're not hitting the true intent that students that have extra needs are in larger class sizes, which correlates to it being more challenging to get those needs met. There are, of course, many slides on that presentation from the state. I am summarizing. It takes into account what your options are, but we know in resource-rich District 59, this is an area that we can do better.
And we do have regular compliance audits from the state across all sorts of programs, and EL is one of them. So that could affect our funding, that could affect our status with the state. So those are areas where they can review, monitor it, and come back with recommendations for these are areas you are out of compliance and need to correct.
I have a question. How does, let's say if we have an 8 in the classroom, though, that does not affect the numbers. So we have 1 classroom,
Yeah, it would have to be a fully certified teacher
a fully certified teacher.
that's assigned to that class.
That is
Yes,
assigned to the classroom completely.
yes.
So I guess, sorry to repeat so many on this point, but it's just, I was completely unaware of this requirement. So I guess I'm wondering, have we taken steps in the past to try to address it, or we know better and we do better?
I think it's such a great example of when we are trying to do what we think is best. The example of let's spread programming out so that is more accessible through our district. It then becomes harder to find specialized staff members for those areas. And then that becomes an issue of also building size and section size. And it really forces us to think, what is the 5th year of the strategic plan? What are those needs? The choices we make today, I think, Ms. Ling, you brought this up earlier. If we do this here, is that meeting our goal here? And how do we find the right fit and the right balance? So over time, as a program expands, rolls up to 2nd, rolls up to 3rd, this community is starting to have a lower enrollment. This one is booming. All of these different things over time can change. And as Dr. Brezhnehan said, that's why we want to get to that finish line of the strategic plan, so we have the ability to withhold some of those fluctuations, but then also look at it annually so we don't have a creep up of any one item offsetting the balance.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And without getting too close to the line of talking about solutions, I will say that I am encouraged that when we compare the columns of junior high versus elementary, we see those outliers get averaged out and it come closer to the middle. So I feel like that at least gives us some direction that it could be attainable, also without completely reconfiguring the sort of clusters that already exist.
So I want to go back to the class size and selection targets. And one thing you talked about is the primary grades, K through 2 being 17 to 23, and the intermediate grades being 22 to 28. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, that looks great on paper, but if we kind of look at, the way things are set up, it's like, well, you can't really change, where people are living and stuff like that to adjust the class size based on, I don't know how to say this. It just seems it's hard to look at, if we're looking at, like, let's say we look at Salt Creek, where we have 3 different programs here. Those 3 grades are 3 different programs are just going up. Those numbers, those class size numbers aren't changing and stuff like that. They're not, with our current structure, we don't have flexibility in that to make that change, is what I'm kind of saying. And then I'm looking at without jumping ahead, how do we really get to a point where we can meet these ideal class sizes? And I think that's something that's going to come later, but I'm interested to see how that's going to come about, is maybe what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think the things, again, that are within our control, we have boundaries. Boundaries significantly impact our schools today. When we presented what our boundaries currently look like, you can see why we have such vast discrepancies. We make choices on a regular basis about where programs go, and yet we don't build. I think what we've missed the mark on is looking 5 years ahead of what the implication of those program changes are, because then we're just changing it back 2-3 years later as those grow or wane. And we need to be in that position to look long-term across these and really anticipate some of these unintended outcomes, because it should not take compliance to tell us that we need to not put our dual language students in multi-grade classrooms with over 25 kids. It shouldn't take that, but yet that's what has become a practice. So I think at the compelling argument side of equity work, compliance becomes compliance because something research told us, and because on our own we don't always do what's right. And so now we are going to do what's right because it's right, and also because we don't want to get and be out of compliance. So I think when we really talk about how do we maximize the success for all of our students, we know how. We just have to do it. And these are the factors that we have control over, that we can impact tomorrow.
Do you know how to do it, or is it something we'll have to investigate?
So that's I have ideas, right? I think we have models and ideas. Districts have. We are not the first. We are not the first to be dealing with this. So there are a lot of models. We are working with Cropper. I think we have to get all that data in motion. But what we need from the board is direction on what are we willing to look at and do in order to achieve the vision. Because there's going to be give and takes. There's no one ideal thing. We may be greater than 15 percentage points outside our ranges, but we'll achieve this instead. And that might be worth it. And those are the judgment calls that we're all going to have to, this board is going to have to make as we build recommendations.
I think
Because
if that's what you want us to do, then you're going to have to
Yeah.
say, if we do this, we'll end up with this, or if
Yes.
we do this, we'll
and that is
so we know
absolutely,
what-
yes. So
what
that is
we're
absolutely where we're
working
going to
on.
get to in the next steps. So I want you to have a real clear, I want to be as transparent as possible. This isn't, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's also, this will put everything out on the table so that even if I'm a parent at one school in one class, I can get an idea of what is everything around me, because equity always sounds great in theory until it's me and my family and my children. And then it's an ask, right? It's what are you really willing to do in order to create a system that's going to be more equitable? And those are going to be what the board is hopefully going to give us direction on. We're going to be coming back. We have ideas. We have conceptualized some things that we will be bringing back for the board to review. And then we can really see, are we able to hit all of these priority targets through these solutions?
And then it goes back to what you said, what Courtney said about, if we do this, what will we sacrifice to get to this?
Mhm.
It basically comes out to me. So we need to come up with, it sounds like we are going to go through this, give our impression of what we think of equity is, and then based on what we've given you as our thing, you're going to come back with, here's some solutions. And that is next thing on the thing, but that's,
Yeah, we'll get
we got a long way to go.
Yeah, and I think just one more comment is, I'm glad you included on that, pointing out that as a result of our programs, we can't have the multiple sections, which has the implication that teachers can't collaborate with each other, students can't be mixed up in different groups. So I think for me, that piece that then Randy raised about we have this class size that's out of our control because programmatically, if we were to create some economies of scale, we gain the ability to have the collaboration. And on top of it, you could also say, okay, for these lower grades, we're going to have 5 classes because we want really small numbers. But as they age up, it's going to become 4 classes. And then you have the ability to collaborate, intermix kids. And again, I think the goal is to hit that without getting it to the level that you're completely isolating programs in silos, right?
So now it's time to discuss facility capacity and usage. These targets, again, are per our third-party associate, Cropper. Ideal utilization, like it says in the slide here, it's approximately 75% for each building, but if it's below 60% or above 90%, that's not recommended. So we're going to go a little bit further into that. So right here, this is the current status of the district. For elementary, the range is anywhere from 41% utilized to 87%. Also for the district, it's average is 64% for the elementary schools. As for the junior highs, the range is anywhere from 65% up to 95% with an average of 80% utilization. Now, when Cropper did this research, they took some of the information from our comprehensive annual financial report, and the way they planned it was 110 square feet per pupil for pre-K through 5. And then for any junior high or 6 through 8 would be 125 square foot per pupil too. So just because the utilization for Brentwood, for example, is 87%, does not mean that there is still space. It's about usable space. And that, I think, is part of the importance of this story.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about in the very, very beginning. Grove is definitely overloaded, and homes could use some of the Grove people if there's anybody who is in a pocket where they could all be moved together.
Okay, so our next piece is looking at what Mardell had referenced before about our live-in and attends. So that last set of information and this information, this is what you saw previously from the Cropper report back in November, I believe. So we hate to be repetitive, but I think it's starting to take this data that we've known and put it in context of all of these other things. So I appreciate our families that are like, why aren't you doing anything right now? Well, this is stuff that takes some long-term planning to fix. It's not just moving kids. I think we'll land ourselves in a bad situation if we do anything too short-sighted. So when we look at this is information that we shared from the Cropper report back in November, but this tells us how many students live within that school's boundary versus how many students live in that boundary and attend that school. So for example, if we just look at Rupley, we have 342 students who live within the boundaries of Rupley. And Tom, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you know this in and out, but only 257 of those students actually attend Rupley. I interpreted that correctly, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So I know it's in a different format. So when we look at the district average, we're looking at 82.6%, and you can see the fluctuation in terms of where students live versus where they attend. And again, there is approximately how many families, students who do a request interdistrict
30 to 50 annually.
30 to 50.
Who do what?
So these are families who make a request to attend a different school.
Oh,
So parent
okay.
request
Okay.
that is reviewed by me and the district team. So take that out. All of the other variances that you see here are purely based on programs. So if I attend an ELS program per my IEP, if I attend a dual language two-way, we only have 3 elementary schools that have it. So if I live anywhere, I'm going to go to one of those 3 schools. I'm outside my attendance area. And same thing when we look at, remember we said Forest View, which does not have dual language. So they would be attending somewhere else outside of there. And then Ridge, which is one of our outliers because it is a school of choice.
So baked into this, though, is the fact that the Rupley boundaries, as an example, aren't just a contiguous area surrounding Rupley. Like when you say live in and attend, it might be like Rupley, and anybody who lives in the current boundaries of
structure,
Rupley,
yes.
which may not all be attached.
Correct.
Right.
Many of our schools have
Yep.
detached
Yeah.
boundaries,
Bird.
a few at least. Yep.
Yes,
Bird.
several, and some to our north, because again, in attempts to create more balance and adjust to the growing student populations geographically.
So I guess I would just point that out to say, like, the figures are sort of even more severe than that because of the fact that even if you live in the boundaries, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the closest elementary school to you.
Correct.
That could be accurate. Yes, correct.
Correct. And that's why boundary changes are not a single solution. Programmatic changes are not a single solution. What we anticipate bringing forth to the board is a combination of those things to create, because this is a very complex district in terms of needs and geographic, infrastructure. So, and again, that was on the right side of the screen, those things that we can't control. So how do we really address that and create that balance, logically building in that sustainability over time with some predictability in it? That will definitely be the challenge.
This next piece is on resource allocation when we discuss financial and personnel targets. And when we discuss per pupil spending, it should be balanced across schools, but we do have to take into account programmatic needs at those schools. Certain programs do cost more. The other thing I'd like the board to remember is per pupil expenses are based on operating expenses. So it's like the cost to run a school day. Only certain expenses like summer school, adult ed, capital expenses, and long-term debt are excluded. So what you'll see is it paints a picture of how much we're spending per pupil at that particular site. Also, the other piece, and I think Ross will talk a little bit more to this, is a teacher experience and education level and how balanced it is or isn't across the district. So when you look at the resource allocation, the financial piece, again, when I mentioned only certain expenses per pupil being excluded, one can see the discrepancies right away. This could be attributed to staff turnover in some of the sites. Another thought to consider is that there are buildings with varying amounts of students, but with similar or the same resources, saying you have 500 students versus 200, but you have the same amount of resources. Some buildings have programs housed only at one particular spot. Some buildings have lower or higher class sizes. We do know that the scheduling has been different across the district over time, so that could also be a factor. But as one sees, there is more of a trend of what's going on with the expenses per pupil with other charts that we've seen. And the average teacher salary is another really interesting piece to look at, because that shows more of a veteran staff with maybe more degrees and whatnot, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with the operating expenses. However, it's still there.
The next slide, as Mr. O'Connor has shared, I would speak to is years of experience average per school. And this was data I had not pulled previously, and it was just very interesting to look at. There's a range of about 7 years from our first school to the school at the bottom. The educational levels are also quite impressive. To give a little bit more context of the numbers, the chart that says BA for bachelor's, that also includes staff who have bachelor's plus another 15 hours. The master's chart is master's and master's plus 15 hours. And then you have staff that have master's plus 30 hours. So you can just see the district averages and where our staff fall in terms of years experience and education level when we look at it through that lens of providing balance throughout our system.
So we're going to hit pause here and ask for board discussion, questions, response.
I want to go back to the financial part of it. So if I look at Forest View and we look at Frost, just the operating expense per pupil, when we buy, let's say we bought our math curriculum, was that evenly spread out for the 10 different elementary schools? So if it was $100,000, each school got $10,000 of the cost associated when you calculate these numbers?
Yeah, so what it does is it is provided to a district account and then it's spread out, but this is from 2021, so it wouldn't have taken that into account.
I'm just using that
As an example, though, yes.
So like anything we bought district-wide, it was evenly spread out amongst each school.
That's correct.
As far as the salaries go with the master's degree and so forth, I don't see how you can do anything about it, because you have what you have. You can't just take this teacher and put her someplace else because she's got a master's degree and she's being paid more. I mean, it's just, you can't balance out your finances that way. Right?
I would say it's kind of somewhere in between something you can control and you can't control.
Well, if somebody's been at a school for many years, you're certainly not going to uproot them just because they're making too much money.
No, and I think that, there's a lot of data points that go into this. And again, these are all data points that the state includes in our report card, and that is public data and information. So this is not, again, these are to lead us to ask questions why. So, for example, if we looked at years of experience across the school, would that be a contributing factor to the positive or to the negative around what we're trying to do across student outcomes. So those are things that, again, we look at so that we can ask, why is it that, or what might be a root cause that leads to it? But it's definitely in terms of just drawing a correlation of what goes into that per pupil expenditure. Placement of teachers and their years of experience do contribute to that number on the left. I think it was probably about 5 years ago, I could be off a few years, that the state required us to do school level expenditure reporting. And this is why. Because if we're not looking at this, we are not going to hit our goal. And again, I would say one of the most significant factors that contributes to a near $6,000 range per pupil. Now keep in mind, taxpayers, right? Your taxpayer dollars are distributed equally they go to District 59 and then they're utilized. So whether you attend Frost or attend Forest View or anywhere in between, that's the same contribution, your rate. So are we doing our due diligence at a school that has if we looked at the class size sections, I believe Frost was one that was on the lower end because it's on that cusp. Do I create a section of 30 or do I have 2 of 15? So now I have 2 teachers for 2 classes of 15. That's going to cost me more money, right? So now we're looking at fewer students and more resources that we provide. And keep in mind too, every school has a principal, every school has an assistant principal, at least one. Every school has a psych, social worker. There are certain minimum thresholds that regardless. And again, that's why that balance among schools, you're paying this, whether you're serving 250 kids or you're servicing 450 kids. And that's a big swing in terms of like equity per pupil.
So how much the operating expense per pupil when we look at the average salary? Basically, our salaries and benefits account for about 80% of our budget, correct?
It's less than that for our district, but
It's in that ballpark, right?
it's like, yeah, I'd say more like 70.
So like 80%, theoretically 80% of our per pupil spending would be associated with
Staffing.
with these costs over on the left side, correct?
Yeah, but then if you look at Ridge and Forest View having the highest operating expense per pupil, and then look in the next column, they're right around the average. So it's really section size.
Right. And
That's
it comes down to
that has a bigger effect.
It comes
yeah.
down to section size. It comes down to what Dr. Brejan's saying, having a psych at every school, whether you have 250 kids, that let's say $100,000 gets divvied up by 250 students instead of 100,000 being divvied up by 400 students. It affects that amount that way. Or a math interventions that we have at each school, language specialist. Okay. But the goal is still trying to get that more into.
Yeah. Again, this is for us to start asking why. And then you look programmatically, program costs vary as well, right? There are some psychologists, for example, require greater credentials when you hire them. So we have to take into some account some of those things. When you look at, special education, that has a higher per pupil expenditure rate. So all of those things factor in. So this isn't the black and white of like, oh, we're doing better here and worse here. It's really, why do we have such a great variance and how can we get it back to a better average? And what are we getting as a return based on the per pupil expenditure? I think that's what the driving force is for me in looking at those numbers.
So do you have any more insight into the why of it? Because I guess I'm struck at how large the discrepancy is.
That's exactly what my face looked like with SLT when we put this slide up, was like, what? I think it goes to the really broad range of sizes we have at our buildings, the swings we have between our lowest, which is at 250, and our greatest, which is at 425.
Yeah, which is big.
It is a big swing.
But you also have the junior highs included in this though too.
Junior highs are in there too.
And again, because it's more students, they hit the average better.
Right. I'm just wondering if we can figure out a way to break this out so we look at this more in a better, in a more refined amount to really identify what's going on. I think that's something that
So again, it's not that we want to get so into the weeds on this piece,
Right.
right? Because we're going to, as Robert it would say if he were here, we're going to stay up in the balcony.
Yeah.
But now it's direction of what is our target then? Do we want to create better balance or at least understand why we're spending more in certain areas? Because that
Understand.
is what we can then bring back, right?
I'm
And
assuming you guys are going to look into the details
Yes.
of why this is happening and get back to us.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think, to me, if you make a change strictly because you want to save some money and you haven't looked at the debilitating effect it will have on program or something, then we're looking at the wrong thing.
100% agree, Mardell.
Yeah.
And we are very fortunate that we are not in a position. And that's what I think is, when we talked about just a little bit ago, what do we want to dream big about to do? We could do that if we get greater balance in these. I mean, we can maximize the efficiency of the resources we have. And that bang for our buck would be huge without cutting costs, right? Because there's a lot of opportunities that are out there. And when we look at those capacities, I'm going to say this. One of the things Cropper said, we could probably stand purely on a number level to close one or maybe even two buildings, just from a pure facility standpoint. Now, I would never sit before you and tell you that that would be a best option for our community. Number one, that doesn't build in predictability or flexibility for us in any way. But how can we best utilize the facilities that we have? I think that's where the focus of our conversation, if we can get to that as a solution, I mean, we could really maximize what we currently have, level this out, and really facilitate, I think, the work around maximizing each student and what they need and how to deliver those best outcomes for them.
Have we cut down on our number of staff at these buildings that don't have as many classes? Because cutting down on staff will
Well,
certainly-
we have had to make some major shifts. In fact, I want to say that we did not end up with, we were able to eliminate our multi-grade classrooms, which is significant, without hiring any new staff to do so, which means we reallocated. And that is significant. We had the ability to do that because we had the staffing in our system to maximize it and level us out.
I'm not saying we should get rid of staff, but
No,
what I'm saying is
yes,
we don't
I
need
agree.
to add more. We can use
Yes.
our people differently.
Correct.
Can we go down the slide? So this is okay.
I think honestly, this is like a really big celebration that we have. Our average over here, I mean, an average 52% of our teachers are at that master's plus 30. I think we have highly skilled and highly qualified staff, and that's definitely something to celebrate.
And this is a place where you could look at equity as a way of raising. There are certain schools where we could encourage staff to do a master's program as cohorts, right? Say, hey, we'll encourage you to do this, and we'll help you out with putting the cohort together, that sort of thing, and move up some of those bachelors into masters and so forth.
You can also see the correlation between how long staff stay at a school and they have time to go and get that master's and that second master's. So as we're moving programs around or we're expanding or cutting back, as Mrs. Schumacher had shared, what is the other cost of that? Because if you have all new staff, then they are at the front end of their career. What does that do for retention? What does that do for professional development? All of those pieces. But yes, the celebration of 84% of our staff have higher than a master's degree, I think speaks a lot to the high standards our staff have for themselves so they can serve their students.
So we are at our last section around transportation. So thank you for hanging in with us. I know this is a lot, but I really appreciate the time for conversation and questions. So our last section is on transportation. Ron.
So again, transportation, it's another data point. There are 3 goals that we have highlighted here about balanced route times, equitable route configurations, and the least amount of travel time to and from school as possible. So and I have to give Mr. Ludloff a lot of credit here because he really did a good job with some of this data here. The average and the ranges of the times, those are one-way times. So if you look at it, the district uses Versatrans to help create routes based on programming, and then the amount of students who need busing to a particular school. Ranges are impacted, though, by combined routes. So you'll see Salt Creek, Bird, Grove, Friendship, Devonshire, Holmes, and Juliet Low. So combined routes with what the driver shortage was happening. That's what happened. Ranges specifically with longer routes are also connected to dual language programs at John Jay and Claremont. So for example, if you look at the district average on elementary, the average route time was 34 minutes with a low 21 minutes and a high of 44. But then if you're at John Jay, there is a route there that is 58 minutes long. Rupley has a low range of 17 minutes. So it's one of those, and even Brentwood's even 15 minutes. The junior highs, you'll see, it's again, the same thing as the average time is about 32 minutes, but the discrepancies into the low and the highs are extremely, I mean, you can go on Grove in the low and it would take you 3 times the length just to get home if you were on a high range of a route. And then the side, and this is nicely broken down, is the special education programming and how that's been affected as well. If the average is 31 minutes for a child to be on a bus for the special education programs, and you see some of these highs are at, 50 plus minutes for the programming.
And that's one way.
Correct.
So if we were going to leave you with one piece of the most compelling data, is that we have children sitting on the bus for over 2 hours in some situations just to get to and from school.
That's terrible.
And that, if we don't understand the impact on so many levels that has, we have to do better. We just have to do better.
We always had that long, or is this something that's more current? I don't remember ever hearing that before in all the years that I've been on, that they've sat on the bus for over 2 hours a day.
I would imagine that this has been going on because the programming has been in those particular sites for so long. It's just finally bubbling up. So
A long time.
You mentioned the driver shortage. Can you kind of go into the potential and impact of that's had on the whole thing? Because I'm looking at this saying, okay, this is crazy, but I know like at some point we were doubling up routes for a while.
yeah, we still are. Just like,
And is that including the time frame? So what are these? So if school gets out at, what time does elementary school get out at? 3:40?
3:35.
3:35. So if school gets out at 3:35 and a kid is getting home at 4:35, that's an hour. But if the bus is making one trip out, then one back, and then one back in, is that including that time, or is that?
Yeah, that's extended. So the Grove is a good example. That's a combined route. I did confirm with Mary and Gonzalez in transportation. So that's a combined route. So basically we're taking 2 groups of kids, combining them on one bus. So I might be the first one off in 20 minutes, but the last one is over an hour. Many of the longer routes are that way, but not every route is that way. John Jay is a great example. That 2-way dual language program that's housed at John Jay, that services kids from the Brentwood, Devonshire, Forest View, and Frost area. They have one bus. Those kids ride that route all the way from John Jay and through. It takes an hour. It makes sense it takes an hour for those 60 kids to get dropped off.
Yeah, because they're making stops throughout.
Exactly.
And also to just see that there's kids at the Early Learning Center who are on for 2 hours a day.
And those are choices. I think that is one of our biggest pieces in talking with Miss Ramsey at our ELC, that transportation tends to be a barrier to getting there. Not just, it's the distance that they would have to travel if they provided their own, or even if they rode a bus. It's significant when you have to travel across the district. Bird is pulling all the way from the east side of the district is where their boundaries lie. So when we start to think and put a name, right? To my child rides the bus for this amount of time versus another child riding for a quarter of that time, or, is able to, lives within walking distance within a couple blocks. That significantly impacts that child's readiness to learn and their ability to learn and how they feel when they go home and they have more work to do in terms of homework. It has impact, let alone that is unsupervised time aside from the bus driver, right? So you can imagine what happens during unsupervised time that contributes, and that all comes back to the school. So a lot to kind of digest around this piece here. I think there are immediate short-term things that we can do. If we get over the driver shortage piece, we can add more routes to lessen some of these times. But the long-term gain is going to have to be made through some other strategic choices by this board.
I know this is not here, but do we have a percentage of kids that ride the bus that don't ride the bus?
Yet from the fall, when we last reviewed this data at the district level, we have 47% are walkers, 53% are bus riders.
Okay, so the bus, we're talking about 53% of our students riding the bus and 40%. Okay.
And Mr. Reed, the other thing to think about is that Ridge, Clearmont, and Jay are not affected by the driver shortage.
Who?
Ridge, Clearmont, and Jay.
Ridge, Claremont.
They are not affected by the driver shortage. They are not doubled up routes.
But I think, as what Dr. President was saying about
Tom
was talking about the bus route for Ridge, because that's a choice program, it pulls kids from all over the district. That route takes a longer time because it's covering a larger area.
Mm.
And same thing with Claremont with the Polish dual language
And
And Jay.
and Jay. But still, it's still a lot of time.
So if we go to the next piece, we're just going to remind you back again, our left and our right. Where can we have impact and where do we have to be responsive? So we can look at our boundaries. We can look at how we structure our schools in terms of our grade level configurations, our class size configurations, and our sectioning. Our student demographics, the exterior of our district boundaries and everything that lies within it, as well as those must-dos by law, are where we do not have control. So the conversation that needs to take place is, where are our priorities? Does the board see the data in the same way that we do? And by we, I mean SLT and myself in giving this presentation. Are there areas where we say this is not a high priority for us, we wouldn't want to look at it? Or are these all high priority areas for us, and let's come up with the best solution that addresses as many as possible? That is what we would like to leave with tonight. So we'll continue our board discussion, but I do want to share with you and jump to next steps. So we want to prioritize what our needs are. We want to continue to celebrate our progress because we can't lose sight of that. Moving towards equity it's truly a journey. It's the first piece that we started with. This is not something that you do overnight or you do, just on a whim. It takes careful, thoughtful planning with really hard decisions that are going to draw a variety of opinions from our stakeholders. And then we want to engage at the individual school and program level. We've begun to do that in some pockets, and we want to further do that throughout this summer and into early fall. We really want to come back to the board with some solutions. What do we think might be the best ideas and changes that we could make to address these things that we're seeing as those areas of need? Or as far as a timeline goes, we really want to take this work. We want to wrap up and celebrate the end of this school year, which has been a year, ups and downs and everything in between. So our summer work is really going to be focused on continuing to work with Cropper, beginning to pull together some, if this, then what? If we did this, what would that look like? What would that solve? What would that create for us? And continuing to engage our community. And then our hope is that we have a real concrete plan for the 23-24 school year that the board would be presented with to take action on, hopefully no later than November of 22, right? 22.
When does summer school start?
June 6th.
I couldn't.
June 6th.
June 5th?
6th.
6th. Okay.
So we got a lot of work to do, but this we could probably all talk about this data in our sleep. This team, we've talked about it so much. It is at the forefront of our minds. So now it's a matter of really looking to, now we get to dream and start creating some solutions about what will align with the values of this community and what would provide the greatest opportunity for achieving the
What
goals of our
schools will
strategic plan.
attend Summer school. I assume you know that by now.
Holmes, Forest View, ELC.
Pardon me?
Holmes, Forest View, and the ELC.
Holmes, Forest View, and
The ELC, the Early Learning Center. We're going to be using that
ELC.
site.
Okay.
Yes.
So I don't know if you have a sense of this yet, but when you come with solutions for us, it was nice to talk about this in the different components, but then the reality is you pull this lever, this goes up, this goes down, right? They all impact each other. So do you imagine you'll be able to come to us with like factors or categories, or is it going to be like, here's our plan and all the pieces?
That's a great question, Courtney. I think that there are some of these components that are going to be, some levers that we could really look at. For example, tightening up our identification process for TDP and really analyzing that. That's a very internal thing that we are going to be working on regardless, right? The larger piece is much more of a puzzle. So we're really working with Cropper, and we're going to be meeting with them to say, okay, given these goals, what ideas or models could you come up with that would help us achieve them? Right. And then that is what we will be bringing forward to review with the full board so that you can see, okay, this is what it would look like if we, for example, closed a school. What does that look like? How does that shift our boundaries? Here's what it would look like if we shifted some of our boundaries and reconfigured some of our schools in terms of their grade levels. That might be an option that's out there. And here's the impact that we would be able to achieve if we did that. And Cropper's already done some initial planning with us, but we're going to be meeting with them soon to really go through with all the data and start looking, okay, here's some tighter parameters based on our discussion from tonight.
So I have a question on transportation. To me, this is one of the trickiest areas to define what a good outcome looks like, because a good outcome could be lowering the highest travel times, getting them closer to the average. But in doing so, as you change things, you put more students in a position where they need to ride a bus, and therefore overall our bus travel times go up, right? And so it's a very tricky situation. Is it a situation where we could solve it partially through increased spending on transportation, adding bus routes, that sort of thing, right?
Yes.
Tricky is the correct word, because in fact, if we didn't have to double up on routes, we wouldn't have. The reason being was that the shortage. So yeah, Dr. Sager, I agree with you. It is going to be tricky.
So I have an ask. Back up to there we go. Beyond our control. One thing we have is compliance. And we talked about the ISB 90%. That's one of the compliant items. I also know we redid our scheduling for for K through 5 to get more PE time to be in compliance. I haven't asked, can we actually have a list of some of the things that we have compliances for? I know there's a huge list of them. There's got to be a huge list of them, but maybe some of the things is there a compliance thing about transportation time? Some of the stuff that we've talked about here, you mentioned there's a compliance in here about, I know something else, like we also had Cropper, we had recommendations like 300 person per school level. That is a kind of a target. Can we kind of here's our targets and here's the stuff that we have compliance. We have that in one kind of piece of paper or something available for us So when we're having this, we start having this discussion even more, we can kind of look back at these quite easily, saying, here's some of the targets we want, but here's some of the compliance issues we got to deal with as well too.
Sure. I think we could definitely do that.
I guess I just have, because I can't get out of the back of my mind, I guess, that there is this compliance issue that is a requirement. And we discovered that with the PE, right? And with some different pieces, and we resolved it. Is there any way we can resolve those 90% and 80% for next school year?
A significant number of those are going to be in compliance simply by us moving out of the multi-grade classrooms. However, we still will have some out of compliance that we know of next year, only because we have dual language and then we have monolingual, and our monolingual sections in some of our schools are such low class sizes. We would have to hire, double the amount of dual language teachers to get, I can't. Frost, perfect example. Average class size at 4th grade monolingual is 15.
So that 90% is school by school. It's not.
It's
district-wide.
individual school. Yes. That is a significant point, Dr. Sager. If it was a district average, it would look very different. And there is a reason why why we look at individual schools, because when we look at aggregates, it paints a very different picture than we look at the reality of our students who are sitting in seats today.
I hate to bring this up because I've been hearing it on your committee, and I thought I understood the whole situation, but after what I've heard tonight, now my mind is going in different places. We're going to rent classrooms at 2 of our schools. I was all for it because it seemed like we had to do it. But if we actually have schools that are a possibility to put students into, or that could be closed or what have you, is there any better way that we can do this without renting classrooms?
I wish there was, Mardell. I think, just from my own opinion, if we were willing to say right now on May 23rd that these 100 students and these 50 students are going to go to a different school next year, the answer would be yes. I don't think that would be the right move to do for our community. I think the fact that we are doing it for 1 year is demonstrating, I think, a good faith effort to allow us to make a long-term plan, as opposed to asking many, many children to make 2 moves in the next 2 years, because I don't know what that would look like. It might just be for 1 year, and I feel like that would be really unfair to a lot of families. And we're already doing some of that to some of our students in order to avoid the multi-grade classroom, which, it's the lesser of 2 evils, which is never a position I want to be in. But unfortunately, I feel like that's the position that we're in right now.
I'm not opposed to.
Yeah. No, I hear you, Mardell. A long-term solution would prevent us from having to do that in the future.
Thank you.
So I think, just to add a little bit to what you said, I think it would be helpful as we move towards a solution to have some kind of triaging of some of these priorities, and the compliance pieces would be at the top. But then, because I think, just in the same way we choose our curriculum, right? We have our drivers, and then you compare that against the curriculum. I think as we're seeing these models, we need to have some stakes in the ground of, these are compliance issues that we must fix, and then these are the most critical, so that if we have to sacrifice over here, we've made a decision, it aligns more with our mission to make that sacrifice because of this benefit, right?
Yeah, so I know Ben Gray is at home listening to this right now. And as our communications person, I'm sure he's already jotting notes about thinking how we can best lay that out to show what our priorities are, what are our most urgent needs, and how can we options for addressing them, as well as then how do we prioritize these other areas to balance out our choices and options. I'm 100% with you.
I kind of wanted to go back to space utilization way back. I'm looking at our space utilization at the elementary level, we're 64%. And we said ideal is 75%, which is great because we have
Wiggle room.
wiggle room. But then I look at the junior high. We're in 80% utilization right now at our junior high level, which is above the ideal utilization for each building. overall. So I'm just concerned about that. And I'm just raising that as a point saying, we're talking about a utilization of 75% for each building, but right now our junior highs are above that.
Well,
And
one is 10% below that. So that's where we have some current wiggle room. But yes, I think the long term, we're going to have to look at where that shakes out in the long term across those buildings. 75% is that ideal, because that's what we ask Cropper, like, what's that sweet spot?
Right.
Leaves you room to grow and feel like you have space to breathe, but you're maximizing your resource, right? And that was that 75. They really said if you hit 90, you are red flag, like, and that means Grove right now is in that zone. So how close are we going to hit every single target? No. I mean, we're going to do our best to move steps closer to, but within balance. And I think from my vantage point, as long as we know the why that something isn't at that target and that it is something outside of our control, then I think that's perfectly fine. Geography, like you said, where people choose to live, we're not going to switch up boundaries, just for the sake of achieving some target. But is it working for the students within that? Do we have great enough balance? And the beautiful thing about District 59 is its diversity. And when you look across our 3 junior highs, it is very representative of the community at large. I mean, that is amazing to me. Now, how do we get that at our earliest so that diversity is something that is embedded from the start in 59 all the way through the end, as opposed to these major swings where our students are experiencing very different things at very different times before they get to junior highs. So that would be my takeaway on that piece.
so I'm going to say, what's next? We got prior needs, celebrate things. I know, we talked about solution coming up in possibly in November, but we're going to have discussions about that beforehand.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess my first question would be to get from the 5 of you that are here today, and then we'll continue on. Obviously I know Robert and Patty, who are not here tonight, but I'm sure they're going to watch this presentation and have some questions and input. But is there anything that we saw tonight or spoke about tonight that is something that we need to really draw attention to, or that you feel is just way off the mark? And yeah, that's something that we could live with. We don't really need to put emphasis there. Or is everything here really, did we hit the mark and these are the things that should be on the table?
Well, I don't think we're all going to agree on everything. It's just like we said in the beginning, you present us with choices and we'll have to vote on them. Because you're never going to get 7 people to agree on every single thing.
So I definitely think for me, you hit the key categories, and whatever else you can give to me of your best analysis as to the why, I would love to have that, because I think, Dr. Bresnahan, to your point, I want to be aware if we are creating the circumstances within our control for an inequity. And I want to understand why, and I want to understand how we're going to address it. But in terms of the categories, I think they're exactly right and comprehensive. And I also have really good confidence that between the talents and skills of the SLT and then the fact that we're also resourcing with like an excellent demographic firm, like I think we're going to get really thought through, data-driven recommendations.
I think that you gave us a good presentation because we needed to know why we are where we are, because we're not happy there. Now we need to know what are the choices we have to make in order to make some of these things right. And we aren't going to get them all right, but as many as we can.
I think I have to say I'm not disagreeing with any of the numbers there, and I think they're all hitting the mark. I'm just wanted to see I'm kind of anxious to see how this is all going to come together. And that's, I think, the $1 million question, or the $64,000 question, depending on how old you are and what game show you used to watch. But I think I'm concerned really about the transportation, the more I look at that, and the spending per pupil. I mean, I'm sorry, but numbers like that just are alarming to me. And that really shows some dramatic inequities. And I know, I understand how they can happen, but they shouldn't be happening.
I'm just amazed at how long some of these kids are on the
Yeah, well,
bus.
that's exactly it. And,
Yeah.
that some of it's explainable.
Yeah.
Some of it's, we need to, some of it has to do with the driver shortage. We understand that too.
Mhm.
But it's something that we hopefully can control and fix.
Right.
It's one of those things that's within our control to fix, and
I
I'd like to
agree.
see us fixing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key thing. It's like, how much we're spending per student. We want to make sure every student has the same opportunities. And yes, I understand that based on numbers and stuff like that, that certain costs are going to be higher and others are going to be lower based on the number of students. But I want to make sure that every student we have has the same access to resources as all the other students. And if it has to do with, we have 450 students at one school and 300 another, and there's one social worker between the two of them, how do we make it 70, 130 to balance that amount kind of thing? I mean, that's kind of like, that's a short-term thinking, but it's like, how do we make sure that, everything is as equitable as possible for our students and our staff? Because we can't forget our staff in this whole thing too. They're the ones that are going to be the ones working with our students, stuff like that. And they need to have the resources and the support from us to do their job. So I know we've been talking a lot about students, but we have the staff that are going to be the ones implementing this whole thing and doing the work. And we want to make sure that they're supportive of it and they're in agreement with it as well too. Joe, you got that look on your face like you're trying to form a thought.
No, I sort of think we've hit on all the categories. I think some of them are going to be give and take from one category to another, right? I especially look at, there was the getting each school to representative within plus or minus 15% may not be possible just due to program choices or geographic issues. Again, as long as we understand why that's the case and it's not something we're doing for historic reasons or there's some issue that's going on there, we're doing the best we can. We just need to understand that you're never going to get every single one of these things perfect. But there also needs to be a longer term way to address this every so often. I feel like it's a thing that's been percolating for a long time in the district that has been avoided being addressed, and we're now taking the big step of addressing everything all at once, and there should be some system to avoid that big step.
No, it reminds me a bit of what at the beginning of Randy and my tenure, like the facilities piece, where we did a big bond issuance and there was a big push for like, how do we figure out how we bake in this forward-looking 10-year analysis every year so that we're not suddenly caught off guard by what are like routine maintenance expenses. So I think similarly, Joe, it's like, I think part of this plan does have a maintenance and sustainability side where and I know you're doing this anyways, right? You're constantly looking at it, but maybe it means that annually us as a board like need to have that conversation with you so that if there is that flexibility in our system to adapt, like we're aware of that adaptation, and then it helps future boards and future superintendents, like not to have to do this massive work.
I think we all want to come up with answers and vote on everything that you came up with that's good and so forth. But on the other hand, that's not ever going to happen. We're not going to get 100%, but we'll do the best we can.
And the best thing is they have to come up with the answers. We just have to agree to them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we all want the same thing. It's just how do we get there?
That is absolutely it, Mardell. I totally agree. So I appreciate I think the conversation and the questions and the input is really helpful for our team to go back and start really thinking about how we can figure some solutions to address some of these things. It really is a multi-year plan. That's why our strategic plan is 5 years. The idea is this is much more about growth and getting towards those goals, as opposed to, we're going to achieve everything in year one or beyond. So I think we have what we need to take our next step and continue to move forward.
So last question. So this presentation will be attached when we send this out when we send out the update to the district.
Yes,
Okay.
correct. This will be available. And we did, just so you are aware, we did have a good set of slides beyond this that were just for reference. So if people wanted to look at, let's say, the boundary maps that we had included in previous presentations, you could kind of look at those appendices and have some history to get context around this.
Can I ask one more question? Just thinking about like the staff and the parents who might be listening to the meeting. So obviously you're in this development stage of figuring out potential solutions between now and November. If they have questions about that, feedback about what they've seen, what are their opportunities to like have a conversation about that? And also, if they just want to share feedback, what's the best way for them to do that?
So that's what Ben and our team are working on in terms of how do we create that feedback loop for just some more general comments and input, as well as then how do we get into a more targeted system. Once we have, I think what's hard too is that there might be another group of people now who saw some school-based data who has some things to share and some feedback to give, which is great. And we absolutely need that. Then when we actually get to presenting some solutions, there are going to be even stronger opinions and the desire to give voice and feedback on what those potential options are. So throughout each of these next couple of steps, we're going to build in those feedback loops and opportunities for us to engage. I think at the school-based setting is the best opportunity, because then you can talk about the nuances that, the realities that each school is experiencing. We just don't want to have those conversations without everyone having context around the district as a whole, because it can't be, I use this analogy that, I have 15 kids here in District 59 and I can't pick favorites. I have to serve all 15 to the best, and they each have their unique talents and skills and needs, and how do we best serve them so that we all rise and lift together. I don't want to, that is truly where I see the equity work for us. So that is definitely what we want to build into our communication plan and our engagement plan around this work. So people feel that they have voice, but that it's educated and informed. And knowing, again, we talked about this a little bit as a board, there are some things you want and need feedback on in order to make a decision. Then there are some things that you need the data and the goal to make the decision. And then it's building in awareness and supports to help the system through the change. And I think we're going to have to identify those pieces.
I have a question. Is this presentation available only in English, or is it translated to a different language?
It will be. I don't want to speak for Ben. I'm going to give Justin and I, but typically we provide everything in a translated format when it goes out.
So I did just think of one more possible thing to think about. That would be within a school when I have two different programs, finding as many opportunities as possible for students within those programs to interact with students in the other program. So we don't get little conclaves within the school that don't talk to each other. And that may be something to prioritize as well.
And I can tell you that is internally already work that we do. When we look at it specifically, at our specials, how do we create more inclusive environments and options for interactivity amongst classroom sections, whether they be in single programs or multiple programs, because, that's how we learn about diversity, right? Is by branching out and having those opportunities. So we're creating those conditions for our students. and even interdistrict, school to school, vertically and horizontally. We have a lot of opportunities, especially with technology. We know how to do it now, right? So I think we have a lot more options in front of us to create those conditions.
I guess I get a little tired of hearing about equity because to me, everything we do should be for each and every child, and that's equity to me.
Mhm. Yeah.
So.
I know once we're there, we won't have to talk about it anymore,
Okay.
right?
I think that's the key thing is we realize we're not there
Mhm.
because we're talking about it a lot now. So now we're like, okay, we've been talking about it.
Well, I think
Time
we've
to do
got
something.
plenty of things to do. There's no
Yeah.
question about it.
If you remember a slide, we're actually talking about justice.
Yes, justice.
And there any other items that will be brought up?
You mean general items?
No, just on this agenda topic.
No.
Just on this agenda-
I
just
just
on
have,
this-
I've got a
this
couple
agenda.
questions, that's all.
I would like to thank the staff for all their hard work on this. I would like to see an updated PowerPoint because my PowerPoint I got is a little outdated from the numbers.
Yes, we revised as of Monday and linked it up today. So we will make sure that the board has access to all of that.
Appreciate it.
All right.
With that, are we ready to move on to the action items?
Yes, we are.
So we have an action item for approval of portable classrooms for Brentwood and Frost Elementary Schools. Do I have a motion? I don't have it in front of me and I can't read that. far.
I can do it if you give me
That
2
jump-
seconds here. Okay, next page. There's a whole bunch of background stuff, and then be it resolved that on, I have it here. Be it resolved on the 23rd day of May, 2022, the Community Consolidated School District 59 Board of Education hereby approves the purchase of 2 portable units, one at Brentwood Elementary School and one at Frost Elementary School. These units will be used for additional classroom space at each of the schools. The total cost is approximately $659,300 for both units at the 2 schools for 1 school year.
For a second.
I'll second that one.
Okay, now any questions, comments?
I did have a question. If we use them for more than 1 year, we've already done the installation, we've already bought them, there's minimal costs, right?
That is correct.
So can I also ask a clarifying question? So the Brentwood is actually filling a need for classroom space because currently a teacher's lounge is being utilized as an educational space. So that is an existing need we've been aware of. The Frost one, I just want to clarify for the board and for people who might be listening that there are some students who, as a part of the elimination of multi-age classrooms, are moving from Devonshire to Frost. However, I understand from conversations and info gathering from Dr. Bresnahan that that is not the reason for the addition of the portable unit, that it would actually be necessary were it not for the shifting of the Devonshire students to Frost.
It has an impact. I'm not going, I don't want to mislead anyone. It is one factor, but it is the sectioning makeup across the building as a whole that is really the driving force in needing this. So it's a combination of, yes, we're bringing over students to eliminate the multi-grade, but we also, like I said, we had the 2 sections at 4th and at 5th that both were sitting at 30. So that created then again 2 new areas. So yes.
And just to continue on what I said before, I'm not opposing this, definitely. But whether or not we use them for 1 year or we need them for a second year, at least we've got them for the first year where we know we need them. But then maybe we can look at some of these things that we were talking about this evening so that we're sure we don't need them the following year.
100%, Mardell.
Yeah, and I think another important point, we talked about a lot of this in our discussion, but that they do have an excellent resale value if we decide that we're not going to utilize them.
Yeah, to the point where the seller they're not even making them and selling them anymore. They're just renting them because they're saying that you could probably get 100% at least resale value because of the expensive raw materials.
But that'd be our cost to try and resell it, correct?
Yeah, but they would help. They already said that they would be all for it because they don't think there'd be a problem.
they become a real estate agent for us and get some sort of percentage of that.
No, I'm getting as much as I can.
But we don't see, hopefully, we won't see a need for these beyond this year.
That is our hope. If we come up with a plan, now it may be a multi-year plan that we'll have to look at. That might be an option that's on the table, knowing that we have these two. But our first goal would be to hit a plan that eliminated the need for schools to utilize portable spaces when we have space available across multiple schools.
I think that's the issue that we hadn't
Yes.
heard before, and
Yes.
that's, I think, what we have to think about.
So of the $659,000, how much of it, it's $440,000 for the 2 units, correct?
That's correct.
So the actual 220,000 is our installing the electrical, the plumbing.
It's all in the motion.
Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments?
Are we ready to vote?
Mhm.
Okay. Mrs. Spino,
Aye.
Ms. Lang, aye. Mr. Mencia, absent. Ms. Petrielli, absent. Mr. Reed,
Aye.
Dr. Sager,
Aye.
Ms. Schumacher.
Aye.
And the motion passes.
Thank you very much. I guess we are now, did you want to add something before we go to adjournment?
Yes, I had just a couple of things I want. I was
Okay.
just- Actually, I've been working extremely hard on all my paperwork so that you, I'm finished giving it to you, all the historical thing. But I came across 2 pictures, and I'm hoping that some of you old timers know who these people are, because I have, this is Kelly Zerfas and me at, Tom, how about these? I have no idea who these people are.
Of course, Tom would know.
Well, he's been around longer than I have. Those are the ones.
Kelly, and I'm guessing someone representing some group.
You
Yeah.
don't know who it is either,
Doesn't
huh?
look like an employee.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Well, you keep them and pass them around. Yeah. See if you can pass it around and find out who the other people are. We've got another graduation coming up. That was from a graduation, the one picture, but I don't know who the other people are.
Do you want to give an update on the graduation?
Yeah, speaking of graduations, a perfect time to announce. So due to weather that is anticipated on Wednesday, and now Tuesday's looking much better, which is working out in our favor. So tomorrow we will be moving our Holmes graduation, which will take place outdoors at Rolling Meadow High School at 7 p.m. Tuesday evening. Grove will be taking place as at its designated time and location, but it will be moved indoors because there will be one setup for both Grove, and then the next night on Wednesday, Friendship will be taking place. So at their designated time, but they will be in their indoor locations at Elk Grove High School. We are super excited. Thank you to our board members who will be in attendance and giving speeches. This has been a long time coming for this class of 2022, and we wanted to make sure that they had the absolute best celebration for them as we send them off to high school. So thank you. And Wednesday's the last day of school for our students. So
It is, huh?
yes,
Okay.
happy end of year.
How did the 8th grade dances go?
But I think I didn't attend, unfortunately, but no, unfortunately I did not. I was celebrating my own celebrations with my 4 kids, but yeah, I think all of the end of the year, I know there was a trip to Navy Pier for our Grove 8th graders. I know today Friendship was at, we're at a game place today. I forget, sorry, my Friendship. Main event, they were at Main Event. Saw some pictures on Twitter. I mean, really, I think our staff and our building leaders and our parents have done such a great job in supporting to make sure this year ended, on a high for our students, which is really, really nice.
Are we ready to adjourn? Have a motion, please?
I'll make the motion. Be it resolved that on the 23rd of May, the CCSD59 Board of Education meeting is adjourned.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Roll call, Ms. Espino,
Aye.
Ms. Lang, aye. Mr. Mencia is absent. Ms. Petrielli is absent. Mr. Reed,
Aye.
Dr. Sager,
Aye.
Ms. Schumacher.
Aye.